For nearly 1,000 years, emperors knelt before it. Soldiers carried it into battle believing it made them unkillable. A dictator once sent men to steal it because he thought it would let him rule the world. And for all that time, no one was allowed to touch it, cut it, or look inside it, until a small team of scientists in Vienna finally did exactly that. What they found didn't just fail to confirm the legend. It rewrote the entire history of one of the most famous weapons on Earth, and the truth turned out to be stranger, in its own way, than the myth ever was. The object in question sits behind glass in the treasury of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, and at first glance it doesn't look like much. It's a spearhead, iron, corroded with age, wrapped in bands of silver and gold, with a strange metal pin driven through the blade near its base. It weighs less than a kilogram, and stretches barely half a meter from tip to base. You could walk past it in a museum case and mistake it for a rusted farm tool if you didn't know what you were looking at. But this is the artifact known across centuries of European history as a holy lance, and in Christian tradition, it carries a claim that few other objects on the planet can make. According to the Gospel of John, a Roman soldier pierced the side of Jesus on the cross to confirm he was dead. Later tradition gave that soldier a name, Longinus, and gave his weapon a legacy that would outlive the empire he served. From that single verse in Scripture, an entire mythology grew. By the early Middle Ages, a lance believed to be the very one described in the Gospel had entered the treasuries of Europe's most powerful rulers. It passed through the hands of the Carolingian dynasty, the family of Charlemagne, and later became one of the most prized possessions of the Holy Roman emperors. To hold the lance, according to the belief that calcified around it, was to hold a fragment of divine authority itself. Coronations were built around it. Oaths were sworn on it. Entire military campaigns were fought under the idea that whoever possessed a spear that pierced Christ could not be defeated. It picked up a nickname that has followed it into the modern era, the Spear of Destiny. In the 20th century, that nickname took on a darker life of its own, fueled by a popular but historically unreliable book claiming that a young, obscure Austrian had once stood transfixed before the lance in a Vienna museum and became convinced that possessing it was a key to conquering the world. That story has been picked apart and dismissed by serious historians for decades. There's no credible evidence the man in question ever had the encounter the book describes, and the tale owes far more to post-war cult publishing than to anything in the historical record. But the myth was sticky, and it attached itself permanently to the object, so that by the time modern science finally got its hands on the lance, it wasn't just a religious relic anymore. It was wrapped in 3 separate legends at once: a piece of the crucifixion, a symbol of imperial power, and a supposed engine of 20th century tyranny. Under that much myth, almost nothing about the object itself had ever been properly tested. That started to change in the early 2000s, when a team connected to the Vienna Institute for Archaeological Science, working alongside the Kunsthistorisches Museum, which oversees the imperial treasury, decided the lance deserved a real scientific look. This wasn't a fringe operation chasing headlines. It was a formal archaeometallurgical study, the kind of painstaking materials analysis normally reserved for major museum-grade artifacts, and the researchers went out of their way to make sure the process would leave the object completely intact. Nothing would be cut, drilled, or dissolved. Every technique chosen for the project had to be non-destructive, which meant leaning heavily on X-ray imaging and high-resolution microscopy rather than the kind of sampling that would have made the results faster but the artifact permanently damaged. Before any of the imaging began, the team had to reckon with just how complicated the lance actually is as a physical object. It isn't one continuous, unbroken piece of iron the way most people imagine a relic like this. It's a composite, assembled and reassembled across centuries. The core is a blade that had, at some point long ago, snapped clean in two, an upper section and a lower section, and the break had been stabilized rather than repaired invisibly. An iron pin had been driven through the blade near the point of the fracture. 2 additional iron plates had been attached along the sides of the lance's socket, shaped in a way that led some researchers to describe them as blade-like additions in their own right. Later still, a metal band had been fitted around the base. Holding the whole assembly together was a leather wrapping, several windings of silver wire, and 3 separate metal cuffs, one of iron, one of silver, one of gold, each added at a different point in the object's long life. In other words, the lance that sits in that glass case today is less a single ancient weapon than a layered historical document, one where each edition marks a different chapter of intervention, repair, and reinterpretation. To make sense of that layering, The team first turned to existing X-ray images taken of the lance while it had been partially disassembled, and paired that with careful examination under a reflected light microscope, the kind of instrument that lets a researcher study surface texture, tool marks, and forging seams at extremely high magnification without touching the metal itself. That early work, done in the fall of 2003, raised enough new questions that the team pushed further. In February 2004, for the first time since 1924, the gold and silver cuffs were carefully removed from the lance, opening a window into the structure that hadn't existed for 8 decades. It's worth sitting with that detail for a second. For most of the 20th century, nobody, not curators, not historians, not scientists, had seen this object in that state. The researchers were looking at surfaces that had gone unseen and untouched since the years just after the First World War. What emerged from that combined imaging and physical examination was a forging history far more intricate and far more human than the legend had ever allowed for. The metal of the core blade matched the style and construction of what specialists call a winged lance, a type of weapon associated with the Carolingian period, roughly the second half of the 8th century. That's not a small detail. It places the manufacture of the blade something like 700 years after the crucifixion, in the era of Charlemagne's empire rather than the era of the Roman occupation of Judea. The scientific dating didn't erase the lance's importance. It relocated it. This wasn't a first-century Roman battlefield weapon. It was an early medieval European spear, expertly forged in the style typical of elite Carolingian weaponry, a period already famous for its highly skilled ironwork. From there, the story the metal told only got more layered. The researchers identified a defect near the very point of the blade, a flaw consistent with metal having been filed or chipped away, the kind of damage some historians associate with the old practice of shaving off fragments of a venerated relic to be enshrined elsewhere as secondary relics, a common medieval devotional custom. The flat sides of the socket showed heavy wear, but the pattern of that wear pointed less toward metalworking tools and more toward the kind of long, steady mechanical stress you'd expect if the lance had spent significant time mounted and carried as a ceremonial bannerstaff, hoisted and jostled for years at a stretch during processions and campaigns. A narrow strip of iron, only about 9 millimeters wide, was found to be missing from one of the wings near the socket, a tiny absence that had already been flagged by earlier researchers decade before, but which the new imaging confirmed and contextualized within the broader pattern of interventions the object had undergone. Then there was the iron pin, the strange metal rod visible through the blade that has become one of the most recognizable features of the lance to anyone who has seen a photograph of it. Long-standing tradition holds that this pin is meant to represent one of the nails used in the crucifixion, fused symbolically into the very metal of the spear that pierced Christ's side. The scientific examination showed that the lower portion of this pin had, at some point, been deliberately removed, and that this removal happened before a specific historical addition was made to the object, a silver cuff fitted with internal brackets designed specifically to hold the shortened pin in place and stop it from sliding downward and out. That silver cuff, the analysis determined, was added during the reign of the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, whose rule spanned the second half of the 11th century. Around that same period, the researchers found, the original leather wrapping on the visible sections of the lance was stripped away and replaced with a winding of silver wire across both the upper and lower portions of the blade, a coordinated overhaul that appears to have happened as one deliberate campaign rather than piecemeal repairs. The very last major transformation the researchers could trace happened centuries later still, in the 14th century, when a gold cuff was added to the object, a final layer of imperial ornamentation stacked on top of everything that came before it. Between the 8th century forging and that 14th century gilding lies a timeline of repair, reinterpretation, and reinforcement that spans roughly 600 years, each layer visible to modern imaging precisely because nobody in the intervening centuries ever fully dismantled or destroyed what came before. It's an almost unheard-of survival. Other spears from the same Carolingian period that archaeologists have recovered tend to come from riverbeds or excavation sites, and centuries underground or underwater leave iron in rough shape, pitted, flaking, often reduced to a fragile shadow of its original form. The Vienna lance escaped that fate entirely because it was never lost. It was guarded, displayed, and passed from treasury to treasury for 1,000 years, which means researchers today can study a Carolingian weapon in a state of preservation that has no real equivalent anywhere else in the archaeological record. There's an inscription on the lance too, added later, in Latin, identifying it explicitly as a lord's lance and nail, language tied to two different medieval emperors who each left their mark on the object as it moved through imperial hands. That inscription is itself a kind of historical fingerprint, evidence of exactly when and by whom the relic identity was formally cemented into the object's public meaning, transforming what had started as a functional Carolingian battle weapon into a sacred symbol of imperial legitimacy. So what does all of this actually mean for the legend that built up around the lance in the first place? It means the object in Vienna almost certainly isn't a 1st century Roman soldier's weapon. The metallurgy and construction point firmly to the 8th century, centuries after the event the lance is said to commemorate. But it would be a mistake to read that as a myth being debunked into nothing. What the scientists actually uncovered is arguably more interesting than a simple confirmation or denial of the crucifixion story ever could have been. They found a genuine, physical, traceable record of how medieval Europe built its own sense of sacred history, quite literally, one repair at a time. Each emperor who added a cuff, replaced a wrapping, or reinforced a break wasn't just fixing an old spear. They were actively participating in constructing a relic, layering their own reigns into an object that would go on to outlast every one of them. The lance's real power was never some supernatural force radiating from ancient iron. Its real power was a belief invested in it by generation after generation of rulers who needed a physical object to anchor their authority to something older and holier than themselves, and were willing to reshape that object, quite literally with their own hands, to keep the story alive. The scientific team's findings were compiled into a detailed academic study, drawing on the combined expertise of metallurgists, historians, and conservation scientists, and cross-checked against earlier technical examinations of the lance conducted decades before, which had already pointed toward a Carolingian origin using more limited methods. What the newer, more thorough non-destructive analysis added was precision, a much clearer timeline, and physical confirmation of exactly how and when each historical layer of the object had been added, information that had previously existed only as fragmented guesswork based on style and inscription alone. There's something worth pausing on in the fact that this entire investigation was carried out without a single cut, drill mark, or destructive sample taken from an object that has survived 12 centuries of European history. Every answer the researchers found came from looking carefully, patiently, with the right instruments, at a surface that had already been telling its story in plain sight the entire time. The floor at the tip, the missing sliver of iron, the ground-down flats of the socket, the shot and pin, the sequence of cuffs, none of it was hidden. It just hadn't been read correctly until modern imaging gave researchers the ability to separate one century's handiwork from another's, layer by layer, the same way a geologist reads strata in a cliff face to reconstruct millions of years of history from what's simply been sitting there in plain view. What makes the Holy Lance's story genuinely compelling, once you set aside the 20th century conspiracy theories that got attached to it, isn't a question of supernatural power at all. It's a question of continuity. Here's a physical object that a Carolingian smith shaped with hammer and fire more than 1,200 years ago that was carried, broken, repaired, reinterpreted, wrapped in gold, inscribed with the names of emperors, hidden during wars, and eventually placed under museum glass, and modern science can now trace nearly every one of those transitions in the metal itself. That's not a myth being destroyed. That's history being recovered in far sharper detail than legend ever offered. The next time someone tells you the Spear of Destiny holds a key to unstoppable power, you can tell them the truth is both less magical and far more remarkable. It's one of the best preserved, most thoroughly documented pieces of early medieval ironwork on the planet, a genuine artifact of Charlemagne's era that spent 1,000 years accumulating the fingerprints of the emperors who believed in it, and modern imaging has finally let us read every one of those fingerprints for what they actually are. So here's the real question worth asking. If the power people believed this object held was never in the iron at all, but in the centuries of belief people poured into it, how many other legendary relics out there are hiding a truth just as remarkable, once someone finally takes the time to look properly? Let me know what you think in the comments.